Story number 1. The Snowman Outside. I'll never forget the storm of '93. It wasn't just the snow, or the wind that howled like a living thing, or the way the house seemed to shrink under the weight of the cold. It was what came with it, what stood outside our window that Christmas Eve. I was 12 years old, living with my parents and younger sister, Ellie, in a small house on the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado. That winter, the snow came early, and by the time Christmas rolled around, it had already piled up to the windowsills. The forecast for Christmas Eve warned of a massive storm, one of those once-in-a-lifetime blizzards that shut down towns and trapped families in their homes. We didn't think much of it. We had food, firewood, and a warm house. We thought we were safe. We were wrong. The storm started just after sunset, the wind picking up and the snow coming down so thick it looked like the world had vanished outside. Inside, we were cozy. Dad was lighting the fire, Mom was baking cookies, and Ellie and I were decorating the tree in the living room. The lights on the tree cast a warm glow, reflecting off the frosted window panes. That's when Ellie saw it. "Look," she said, pointing to the window. At first, I thought it was just the snow playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it, a figure in the yard, tall and white, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the storm. It looked like a snowman, with a round head, broad shoulders, and a bulky torso, but something about it was wrong. The proportions were off, the shoulders too wide, the head too small, and the face, there wasn't one, just a blank, smooth surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. "Did you make that?" I asked Ellie. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "Did you?" I shook my head. Neither of us had been outside since the storm began. We called Mom and Dad over, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. "It's just the wind," Dad said, brushing it off. "Probably knocked down some branches or drifted the snow into a weird shape." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But then it came back. Later that evening, as we were sitting down to dinner, I glanced out the window and froze. It was there again, closer this time, just a few feet from the house, standing motionless in the yard. "Mom," I whispered, "it's back." She followed my gaze, her smile fading. "Frank," she said, her voice tight, "look outside." Dad got up and peered through the frosted glass. His face darkened. "Who the hell?" he muttered. He opened the door, letting the cold rush in. "Hello? Is someone out there?" No response, just the howl of the wind. "Probably some neighbor kids messing around," he said, slamming the door shut. But his tone didn't match his words, and I noticed the way his hand lingered on the deadbolt. By the time we went to bed, the storm was at full force. The wind battered the house, the windows rattling in their frames. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of that figure in the yard. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. And then I heard it. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was faint at first, like the sound of branches scraping against the siding. But it grew louder, more deliberate. I sat up, my breath fogging in the cold air of my room. "Ellie," I called softly. No answer. I crept to the window, my heart pounding. The frost on the glass obscured the view, but I could just make out a shape, a hulking shadow moving across the yard, heading toward the house. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound was coming from the wall just outside my room. I ran to my parents' room, shaking them awake. "It's outside," I gasped. "Something's outside," Dad groaned, rubbing his eyes. "It's just the wind," he said. "No," I insisted. "It's not the wind. It's scratching the house." He sighed and got up, throwing on his robe. "Fine, I'll check." We went downstairs together, the house eerily quiet except for the faint scratching. Dad turned on the porch light and opened the door. Snow swirled in the wind, but the yard was empty. "See?" he said, closing the door. Nothing there, but he was wrong. The next morning, we found the marks, long jagged scratches along the siding of the house. as if something with claws had been trying to get in. And the footprints, massive, deep impressions in the snow, leading from the forest to the house and back again. "It's an animal," Dad said, though his voice lacked conviction. "What kind of animal walks on two legs?" Mom whispered. The rest of the day was tense. None of us wanted to admit how scared we were, but the fear hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. By nightfall, the storm had subsided, leaving the world eerily still. We locked every door and window, drawing the curtains tightly, but as we sat by the fire, trying to pretend everything was normal, we heard it again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. This time, it was louder, closer. It circled the house, moving from wall to wall, as if searching for a way in. "Stay here," Dad said, grabbing the fireplace poker. He opened the front door and stepped outside, his breath fogging in the icy air. The yard was empty. Then the scratching came again, this time from the back of the house. Dad ran inside, slamming the door. "Get upstairs," he barked. We huddled in my parents' room, the door locked, listening as the sound moved through the house. Footsteps, slow and heavy, creaked across the wooden floorboards downstairs. Then came the knocking. It wasn't frantic or angry, just steady, deliberate knocks, as if whatever was out there was waiting for us to answer. "Don't move," Dad whispered, clutching the poker tightly. The knocking stopped. Then came the voice. "Let me in," it whispered, faint and guttural, like the sound of wind through a cracked door. "It's cold out here." We didn't sleep that night. By morning, the tracks were back, leading from the house to the forest. The scratches on the walls were deeper, more vicious. We packed our things and left that same day, driving through the snow to stay with relatives in town. When we returned weeks later, the house felt different, hollow, empty. We never saw the figure again. But every Christmas, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees, I remember that shadow outside the window, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. Story number 2. The Shadow of Dyatlov. I had always loved the cold. There was something pure about the snow, the way it blanketed the world in silence, softening edges and muting sounds. That winter of 1959, I thought the cold would bring nothing but joy and celebration. But the cold lied. It wasn't silent, it whispered. It wasn't soft, it smothered. And it wasn't pure. It was Christmas Eve when we arrived at the village near Dyatlov Pass. There were 6 of us, students, friends, and lovers, brimming with youthful arrogance and the belief that the world was ours to explore. We had traveled from Sverdlovsk for a holiday adventure, drawn by the allure of the Ural wilderness and the strange, haunting stories that surrounded the area, stories of disappearances, strange lights in the sky, and whispers of a shadow that roamed the mountains. We dismissed those tales as the superstitions of old villagers, their warnings little more than campfire stories. But as we unpacked our supplies in a small cabin borrowed from a local hunter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The cabin was tucked at the edge of the forest, its wooden walls groaning under the weight of snow. Beyond the clearing, the trees loomed like silent sentinels. That first night, we laughed and sang, warmed by a bottle of homemade vodka passed between us. The storm came as we celebrated, a sudden, furious wind that screamed through the trees and pelted the windows with icy shards. The laughter faltered. We huddled closer to the fire, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls. That's when we heard it. It was faint at first, like the groan of ice shifting under its own weight. Then it came again, louder, sharper, a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. The room fell silent as we strained to listen. It came from the forest, somewhere beyond the storm's howl. What the hell was that? Victor, the oldest in our group, muttered. His face, usually calm and confident, had gone pale. Probably just a bear, Elena said, though her voice wavered. We tried to dismiss it, but the growl came again, closer this time, It was followed by the crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the snow. My pulse quickened as I exchanged a nervous glance with Katia, my closest friend. Then came the scratching, long, deliberate strokes against the side of the cabin, as if something or someone was dragging claws along the wood. "It's just the wind," I whispered, though the lie tasted bitter in my mouth. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the frantic beating of my heart. Then, outside the frost-covered window, a shadow moved. It was massive. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but as the shadow passed again, I saw it clearly: broad shoulders, impossibly long arms, and a head that brushed the eaves of the cabin. I paused, and I swear I saw it tilt its head, as if listening, and then it was gone. No one slept that night. We stayed by the fire, whispering theories and half-hearted reassurances. Morning came slowly, the storm easing into a sullen gray sky. Victor and Andre volunteered to check the perimeter while the rest of us stayed behind, cleaning up and trying to shake off the lingering fear. They returned with grim faces. "You need to see this," Victor said, his voice tight. We followed them to the edge of the clearing, where fresh snow had buried most of the night's tracks. But not all of them. There, pressed deep into the snow, were footprints, enormous footprints. Each one was nearly twice the size of a human foot, with long, claw-like impressions at the toes. The tracks led from the forest to the cabin and back again. "No bear does this," Andre said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We should leave," Katia said. Her usual defiance was gone, replaced by a trembling fear I'd never seen in her before. Victor shook his head. "We came to celebrate Christmas. We're not running because of some tracks, but we should have." That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin as if it were trying to tear it apart. We bolted the doors and windows, but it didn't feel like enough. The growls came again, closer, angrier, and then the banging started. It wasn't the wind. Something was hitting the door, hard, over and over. The wood groaned under the impact, splinters flying as we scrambled to block it with whatever we could find. Andre grabbed a poker from the fire and brandished it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, though there was no one to hear him. The banging stopped, and for a moment, the silence was worse. Then we heard it, the sound of something heavy moving on the roof, slow and deliberate, the creak of wood under its weight. My blood turned to ice as I looked up, the ceiling beams trembling under the strain. And then it jumped. The force shook the cabin, sending us sprawling. The growls were deafening now, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The windows shattered, and the cold rushed in, extinguishing the fire and plunging us into darkness. In the chaos, I heard someone scream, then another, and then nothing. I don't remember how I made it out. When I came to, I was lying in the snow outside the cabin, my body trembling with cold and fear. The cabin was in ruins. The roof partially caved in. The walls splintered. Katia was beside me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They're gone," she whispered. "All of them." We stumbled back to the village, half mad with fear. When we told the villagers what had happened, their faces darkened. They spoke in hushed tones about the Cornea 10, the Black Shadow, a creature that roamed the mountains, drawn to the scent of fear and blood. A search party was sent to the cabin, but they found no bodies, only more tracks, leading back into the forest and toward Dyatlov Pass. I never returned to the mountains. Katia and I tried to move on, but the memories never left. And every Christmas, when the wind howls and the snow piles high, I hear it again, that growl, low and guttural, echoing in the dark. And I wonder if the Black Shadow is still out there, waiting. Story number 3. The Shadow on the Glacier. I never should have gone to the Himalayas. I wasn't ready for the climb, the cold, or the thin air that clawed at your lungs like invisible fingers. But in the winter of 1953, I was a young man with too much pride and not enough sense. When I was offered a spot in an expedition to the Everest region, I jumped at the chance, ignoring the nagging feeling deep in my gut that this wasn't just another adventure. We were a group of 6 seasoned mountaineers, scientists, and me, the novice, there to document the journey for a British newspaper. I carried a camera and a notebook, thinking my role would be to capture the beauty of the mountains and the camaraderie of the team. What I captured instead was something no one should ever see. The trek started uneventfully. For days, we climbed through frozen landscapes that seemed more alien than earthly. The air grew thinner, the temperatures colder, but the group pressed on. By Christmas Eve, we had set up camp at over 5,000 meters, nestled in a shallow valley surrounded by jagged peaks. The wind howled constantly, and the snow underfoot crunched like brittle bones. That night, the mood was light despite the conditions. Someone had smuggled a bottle of brandy, and we passed it around, sharing stories and laughs under a sky scattered with stars. The mountains loomed above us, black silhouettes against the night, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only people in the world. Then we heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deep, guttural, and resonating through the valley like a drumbeat from hell. Everyone fell silent, the laughter dying in our throats. The noise came again, a low growl that built into a roar, echoing off the cliffs and shaking the snow beneath us. "What the bloody hell was that?" muttered Roger, one of the climbers, his voice barely more than a whisper. No one answered. We huddled closer to the fire, the warmth doing little to dispel the chill creeping into our bones. The next morning, we found the tracks. They started just outside the perimeter of our camp. Massive prints sunk deep into the snow, each one nearly twice the size of a human foot. They led away into the distance, disappearing over a ridge. We argued about what could have made them. A bear, perhaps, though the size and shape didn't match. A hoax? Unlikely, given how remote we were. Could it be a Yeti? Someone asked, half joking. The laughter that followed was forced, brittle. No one wanted to admit it, but the thought was there, hanging heavy in the frosty air. That night, the sounds came again, louder, closer. The growling turned into a roar, and this time, it wasn't alone. There was a second roar, then a third, blending into a cacophony that seemed to come from every direction. I sat in my tent, clutching my notebook, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then came the sound of something heavy moving through the snow, slow and deliberate. It circled the camp, the ground vibrating with each step. "Stay inside," shouted our leader, George. His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear in it. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the tent next to mine collapsed with a deafening crash, followed by a scream, a terrible, gurgling sound that was cut short too quickly. I bolted out of my tent, nearly blinded by the snow and wind. One of the tents lay in ruins, its canvas shredded like tissue paper. Of its occupant, Roger, there was no sign, just bloodstains in the snow and a trail of those enormous footprints leading away. By morning, the storm had eased, but the mood in camp was grim. We debated whether to continue or turn back. George was adamant about pressing on. He didn't want to admit defeat, not to the mountain, and certainly not to whatever had taken Roger. But something had changed. The mountains no longer felt majestic or awe-inspiring. They felt hostile, malevolent. That night, none of us slept. The growls came again, and the footsteps, whatever it was playing with us, testing us. On Christmas night, the thing came back. This time, we saw it. It stood at the edge of the camp, just beyond the firelight, a massive, hulking silhouette against the snow. Its arms were long, almost dragging on the ground, and its head was too large for its body, with a crown of matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the fire like molten embers. For a moment, none of us moved. Then someone screamed, and the creature roared, charging into the camp. Tents crumpled as it barreled through, swiping with arms that ended in claws the size of knives. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my camera, but I must have, because I have photos of that night. Blurry, indistinct images of chaos, snow flying, firelight flickering, shadows stretching and twisting, and always, in the center, that thing. When I finally stopped running, I was alone. The camp was gone. The others gone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant howl of the wind. I spent the next 3 days stumbling through the snow, trying to find my way back to civilization. When a rescue team finally found me, I was half frozen, delirious, mumbling about shadows and growls. They never found the others. Weeks later, Roger's body was discovered near the base of a cliff, torn apart in a way no animal could have done. I returned to England, but the mountains never left me. I still hear the growls in my dreams, still see those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. I tried to forget, to convince myself it was just a bear, or a trick of the mind brought on by the altitude and cold. But I can't, because I still have the photos. And in one of them, if you look closely, you can see it, standing in the background, watching me, waiting.